Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning to some of you. My name is John Brzezinski. I'm with Phone to Action. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Before we kick things off, I've got a couple of housekeeping items to bring everyone up to speed on. First off, yes, we are recording today's webinar. And yes, we will be sending out a link to everyone who registered. So anyone who missed it, or anyone who'd like to rewatch it, can do so. Yes, we will be taking your questions in the second half of the presentation. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. So if, while our speakers are presenting, you have a question, type it in. And when it's time for Q&A, we'll be sure to respond. Also, at the very tail end of the webinar, there's a brief survey. It's just 3 questions that we'd like to encourage everyone to please respond to. We promise to read all of the responses and take everything into account. So, with that said, I'll turn things over to today's moderator, my colleague, Thad Cull. Thad?
Appreciate it, John. Thanks for kicking us off. My name's Thad. As you heard, I'm a strategic account executive here at Phone to Action. Work hand in hand with our customer success team to make sure our clients get the absolute most out of our relationships with them. Now, some of you here know us better than others. I do want to start with a couple statistics. The nearly 40 million advocates using Phone to Action have combined to make more than 102 million connections with lawmakers. 36 people take action every minute, which means 52,000 people are forming some kind of connection every day. And I mention those because I love bragging, but also to point out what we're capable of seeing that no one else is. Phone to Action has thousands of clients in government affairs, and that means we have a unique position and a unique perspective. We can validate what's effective. We can show you things you might not have seen or thought of. You'll hear some of the trends we've noticed during this one-of-a-kind past year. Moreover, how your peers are looking ahead as the world opens up. We're aiming to plant seeds for how you might want to engage with your own advocates based on what we know works. And we're thrilled to have 3 of those clients join today's panel to talk about some of the challenges they've faced and how they've overcome them. Deanna, Luke, and Chris bring with them a lot of experience and a lot of success. And we intend for you to walk away with some real concrete recommendations for your team's initiatives as we head into the summer and fall and even look toward 2022. Now, before I turn things over, I'll use just a few minutes to share a couple of the major themes that have come out. In a nutshell, 2020 was unlike any year we've seen, as you might have expected. There were different really important issues taking turns on center stage, and with everyone forced to depend on technology, there was a certified boom in digital advocacy. We expected growth in an election year, we expected growth under the pandemic, but all of those expectations were blown away. In the first half of last year, we saw 32% more activity than during the same time the year before, and 3.4 million new advocates joined the platform. That's double the rate that they did in 2018 and quadruple the rate they did in 2016, obviously the previous 2 election years. And in 2021, by the way, it's been more of the same, and in fact, even faster, as many advocates joined Phone to Action in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, 3 million plus people as in the entire first half of 2020. However, the flood of messages from all over, other people have noticed this too, are looking to capitalize on big success of digital advocacy, has the potential to create what we call advocate fatigue. And with more competition than ever for people's eyes and minds, competition in their inboxes, advocates can start to feel overwhelmed. And as a result, they slow down their participation. The panel is going to discuss using new tactics to get people's attention, acquire new supporters, and keep up the momentum so you can keep things fresh and steer clear of that fatigue. Now, in spite of the damage done by the pandemic to fundraising and to in-person events, which of course go hand in hand, digital organizing worked for nonprofits. Whether it was fighting for funding in schools, COVID relief in underserved places like prisons, for environmental causes, certainly. Nonprofits mobilized more people last year on the platform than corporations and associations combined. Now, it's clear that virtual solutions can replace in-person events. When it came to sit-downs, town halls, fly-ins, there were obviously no other options. And even as people start to get together again, In-person events are being complemented virtually to boost participation in a cost-effective way. Chris Masick of the Alzheimer's Impact Movement is going to talk about his group's success in events that were forced online. Governments are working more online too. State and local bodies are making plans to keep streaming, even their committee hearings, to make viewing easier. There's a draft bill in Massachusetts that would require every municipality to make public meetings accessible to citizens who can't be there in person. Now, of course, government affairs is a people business. On the people part matters a lot. Not that I need to tell this group that. Losing the ability to catch up in the hallways with lawmakers, with their staffers, with peers, number one professional disappointment by far that I heard about last year. Our clients adapted quickly with technology, not only to conduct grassroots advocacy, but to help their government affairs teams own lobbying. With normal communication pretty much cut off, the importance of figuring out lawmakers' thoughts through every possible other channel became really clear. And Luke Bowler of ClearPath is going to talk about using digital tools as a complement to, not a replacement for, lobbyists' in-person work. But with that online aspect here to say, a focus of today's discussion is going to be how best to merge those disparate worlds in the months and years ahead, when we're likely to come up against more uncertainty and more change the way things are going, and not less. I'm pleased that Deanna Noel will lead us off. Deanna is a director of national outreach at Defenders of Wildlife, which has protected and restored species and habitats facing danger in North America for over 70 years. She's going to describe their successes in transitioning constituent lobby meetings to a virtual format, and Defenders' novel use of videos from their dedicated supporters to spread awareness and advance the organization's federal policy agenda. Deanna?
Great, thanks, Thad, and thanks, John. Again, Deanna Noel, so the Director of National Outreach with Defenders. And my team at Defenders, like I'm sure many of us, or many of you watching from home, have had to be really flexible and nimble with our approaches to advocacy throughout the pandemic. And while we all will talk a lot about the challenges that we've faced, I do really feel like we've come out, we're emerging from the pandemic with a lot of solutions to advocacy problems that we will continue to implement and use and rely heavily on, even as we start to piece together a more in-person world of advocacy with the virtual side of things. So one of the biggest challenges that we faced in outreach was how to keep our top performers and activists really motivated and engaged and wanting to tap into our federal advocacy goals, while also figuring out ways to engage new people and bring new activists into the fold. As Thad mentioned, activist fatigue is definitely something that we always struggle with, and trying to find new ways to engage people. And when we're all in a virtual setting, that definitely has been part of the framework that we have to figure out how to best engage people. So one thing that we've talked a lot about is, throughout the pandemic, people have really been missing their communities, obviously, and missing the ways that we traditionally interact with one another. So one tactic that we found a high success rate is pairing phone to action keyword campaigns with videos for social media. We know that a lot of our younger activists, more in the college age range, which is one of our fastest growing networks of advocates at Defenders, are really obviously well-versed in using social media to communicate with one another, but also to communicate with decision makers. So we partnered with some of our top advocates in Arizona on a short video for social media that raised awareness about our border wall campaign and talking about threats that the border wall poses to biodiversity and also local communities. So the purpose of the video was to encourage viewers to text border to 52886 to send a petition directly to their member of Congress on the border wall issue. So this was a really simple, short, video tactic that fulfilled three main goals for Defenders. One of them being to create an opportunity for engagement for our top performing activists of something that they really were excited to be a part of. Younger people especially are excited to tap into any social media endeavor. And so this was really something that they were asking for and excited to be a part of. The second goal is, of course, delivering petitions directly to key members of Congress. And the third is that using this video on social media expanded our organic reach and got more people to join our virtual phone to action database. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is just an example of the text that folks got once they texted border to 52886. And this was the petition page that folks were looking at and entering their information to then send along to their member of Congress. So another tactic that Thad mentioned that we've relied heavily on throughout the pandemic and will really continue to lean on are virtual meetings with members of Congress. We actually had a big DC fly-in plan for the month after the pandemic started and lockdown started that we pivoted to totally virtual. We held our second big virtual fly-in in June. And then between those two big kind of traditional meetings with members of Congress online and their staff throughout the year. One thing that I mentioned that's been really important to my team at Defenders is to figure out ways to facilitate a community feeling amongst our activists. We know, as Thad mentioned, folks are getting pulled in a lot of different directions. There's many ways to engage. There's webinars that we could all attend every single day. And so we wanted to be set apart and figure out ways to really foster that sense of community amongst wildlife supporters. So one way that we did that through our last fly-in was to work with Phone to Action on an action center, which is what you see on the slide here. This was a location that folks could visit to view all the resources that we pulled together for the fly-in. So fact sheets, talking points, professional bios, but we also used it as a way to incorporate petition campaigns directly to their members of Congress on the issues that we would be advocating for in those meetings. The other way that we used it to build community was to incorporate a phone to action campaign so that in the middle of one of our issue briefings, we encouraged folks to get out their phones and text testimonial to 52886. This then prompted folks to, through a series of prompts, to get them thinking about their connection to biodiversity. Starting to think about, why it is that they advocate with Defenders, why they're excited to be a part of our virtual Grassroots Advocacy Week. So not only did this help people form their personal narratives, which of course is really, an important ingredient to any communication with a member of Congress, but it also allowed us to then post every single testimonial in the Action Center. So folks could go in there and learn about what motivates their peers to take action and really, get to know one another a little bit on a little more personable level. If you want to advance to the next slide. We might be stuck. Well, as you're transitioning, I'll keep going. Some of the results from our video and our fly-in. For the video, we generated around 200 petitions direct to target members of Congress. We also brought in 88 new advocates, just folks that organically saw the video posted on social media. For the recent fly-in and just the meetings throughout the year, we found that these virtual meetings have in many ways actually been more successful than the in-person meetings on the Hill. There's some reasons that we're not sure of, but I think one big benefit of having virtual meetings is that our activists are actually able to more frequently meet with their member of Congress. We're seeing congressional staff actually recognize some of our top advocates that are repeat lobbyists that meet with us. We're also finding that some of the intel that we're getting direct from congressional staff is sharper and more specific than what we actually get in face-to-face meetings on the Hill. The last thing, it's a great activist cultivation tool. It's a really hands-on tactic that folks, well, we actually say a lot to our younger activists who are in college or kind of just getting into the workplace is that the skills that you're building through working with Defenders, joining virtual fly-ins and virtual meetings are real world, communication and advocacy skills that you'll be able to put on your resume and carry on, will be beneficial to you as you get into the professional work world. The last thing I'll say on the Action Center, of course, really great way to organize and engage our advocates and build that sense of community. And moving forward, our plan is to create a similar action center for our top ecosystem of advocates called our biodiversity ambassadors, as a way for those activists to, again, find their community of like-minded wildlife advocates online, have access to resources, be able to take action on our campaigns, and of course, build relationships with defender staff and others in our advocacy realm. And I will stop there.
Deanna, thank you so much. Combining supporters' own words in their own videos, obviously really powerful and effective, and something that we here at Phone to Action are working hard on making more common and more official. Hint, hint, plenty to come down the road. Thanks so much. Next up is Luke Bowler. He's the managing director at ClearPath, whose goal is reducing carbon emissions through innovation in energy and industry. His career includes more than a decade on the Hill as chief of staff and comms director for members of Congress and Senate committees, leadership of communication strategy and public affairs campaigns for energy companies, trade associations, and government entities. Luke's going to dive into the importance of knowing exactly what lawmakers are saying in their own words about your issues and how technology can keep you aware around the clock. Luke?
Yeah, thanks, Thad, and thanks for everybody who's tuned in. So ClearPath is an organization in DC that works on federal policy in the clean energy space. So we work primarily on clean energy innovation and industrial innovation to decarbonize our economy, which is a way of saying we work on climate change policy. And what makes us a little bit unique is we work mostly on the right of center. Everything we focus on is bipartisan, but we work a lot with Republican members of Congress, which isn't always something that you associate the two things together, Republican and climate change. But we are a fairly small organization in DC, and we don't fundraise. We don't have much grassroots capacity, and we don't have a membership base. So we really rely on our team to be present in DC on Capitol Hill, walk in the halls, go into meetings, go into events, and hosting events. That obviously all stopped last year. So we had to get real creative with how we were going to try to get our policy objectives enacted into law without that direct in-person, pound in the pavement lobbying. So how do you do that is obviously the challenge. And what we found was really effective was just knowing exactly what members are thinking. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And the best is obviously in person, but to track everything they're saying on these issues. And you'd be quite surprised that they're actually talking about these issues in a lot more ways than we normally have access to. So what they say doesn't always make it into the headline of a news story. It doesn't make it onto the cable news networks, may not even make it to their social channels, but they're talking about these things in committee hearings and in other places on their webinars. But it's a lot of different members to track in a lot of different places. So how can you consolidate that and really track exactly what their sentiment is on clean energy and then turn that into real action? And so what we do is find these members that may not be your traditional energy supporter, but are interested in it and something they've said, and then we can target our outreach directly to them and maybe connect them with a sponsor of a bill that they're looking at or interested in. Maybe provide some educational documents and reports that we've put together, and offer to do briefings via Zoom without that in-person component to that. And we had some real success. We had probably our most successful legislative year at the end of 2020 with the COVID relief and end of the year omnibus. It actually included the Energy Act of 2020, which was very bipartisan, had a number of clean energy technology provisions in that bill that we work very intimately on, and we're able to gain enough support on all of these things to get it into that package, largely because we built out a larger coalition than your traditional committee chairs and members who are always on the news talking about energy or climate. And so I think on the next slide, it's just a quick snapshot here and just a really amazing tool of how you can get all of these things in your morning email. Like I said, not every member is going to tweet when they say something about nuclear energy or carbon capture technology. It's not a big news of the day, exciting thing that they're going to dedicate social media space for. It may not get picked up in the news, but they are talking about it. They're interested in it. And so how can you get all of those avenues into one place? And then what do you do with that? So you can track it, you can, do with your own internal tracking devices, and then do your direct outreach to them. The other way that we saw was really impactful was earlier this year. There was a big energy innovation agenda rollout, and finding new voices to be a part of that. Like I said, it's not a normal historical thing for Republicans to go out and talk a lot about climate change, but there were over 40 members that we helped corral and identify based on some of the interest that they've had in committee hearings, on floor debate, and other places that we were able to help bring them together and roll out a big, robust climate policy agenda.
Fantastic. Luke, thank you so much. What Phone to Action's acquisition of GovPredict has brought to the table for advocacy, of course, beyond the grassroots, are some new dimensions that we are really, really excited about. To wrap up is Christopher Massey. He's the Senior Associate Director of Advocacy at the Alzheimer's Association's Alzheimer's Impact Movement. They've got more than 60,000 advocates who have made an amazing 360,000 connections with legislators. AIM conducts fly-ins every year in Congress and in every state. Of course, their usual plans got disrupted, but the group managed that transition with incredible success, thanks to planning carefully and using all available tools. Chris?
Thanks, Thad. Yes, so for the last 30 or so years, the Alzheimer's Association and now the Alzheimer's Impact Movement has been hosting a fly-in lobby day, if you will, on Capitol Hill called the Advocacy Forum. This event generally features about 1,000 or so folks and is a multi-day event that involves recognition of volunteer advocates, staff training, volunteer training, celebration, and most importantly, a Hill Day, a lobby day, where we try to meet with every single member of Congress and or their staff within a single day. And of course, as everyone knows and has been stated a number of times on this call, the pandemic came along and threw that for a loop. Due to CDC guidance, public health guidance, and other factors, in-person meetings were simply not a reality, and they were not in the cards for us in terms of the advocacy forum or some of the other events that we would do that are of a similar nature in the states. The Alzheimer's Association has for many years conducted state advocacy days in nearly all 50 states or all 50 states, depending on the year, and the District of Columbia. So these events were critical to our advocacy efforts, and unfortunately, the pandemic really got in the way of that. So we had to rethink, we had to recalibrate and look at how we were going to approach these. We could simply have canceled them and thrown our hands in the air and said, we're frustrated and things stop there. But for our constituents, that's not going to fly. So instead, we took a look around and we said, what can we do that's different? What can we do to maintain our high level of engagement, high level of involvement? And the first thing we did is we decided we were going to go full bore with virtual events in the states, as well as for our advocacy forum in DC. And so we began by rethinking what that looked like, trying to recreate a lobby day in its exactness online is not an achievable thing. It really just can't happen in the way that folks were used to. But we could do a lot of what we had done before. That includes meetings with nearly every member of Congress. That includes trainings. That includes preparing materials and distributing those materials, supplementing that with celebrations, videos, things like that. And so what we did is we first began or continued our ongoing recruitment efforts to bring people in through virtual platforms, to get people involved, to get people signed up, if you will. For a number of years now, we used Phone to Action as our SMS recruitment platform. And so we expanded those efforts specifically around these virtual events. Some of our states ran localized campaigns. For the Advocacy Forum, we set up specific SMS opt-ins where folks could get onto the list, find out about the upcoming event and actually a series of events. We also realized that the 1-day, 8-hour training in a hotel room or in a conference room was simply not feasible. And so we set up a series of trainings over the course of the months leading into the Advocacy Day. So beginning in January of this year, we began hosting things like a Welcome to Congress event and other training events and rollout events that better prepared both our staff and our advocates for the virtual engagement that was to come. Many of our states replicated this formula and did similar build-up events virtually with their advocates in the days leading up to their Advocacy Days. Because our training sessions weren't necessarily restricted to a physical space, we could also be a little bit different with how we addressed materials and handouts, things of that nature. And so I'll talk about those things in just a second. So to talk about SMS and shortcodes, very simply, we just made appeals over and over again in various spaces. Social media, of course, was a big avenue for us, putting feelers out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere. We began to ask folks to get involved. We asked them to take online actions, but we also asked them to simply sign up. Phone to Action has a number of ways of running campaigns through the platform where individuals can sign a petition. They can just fill out a form, simply sign up, or RSVP. They can take an action and communicate a message directly to elected officials. And so the platform allowed us the flexibility to tweak as needed for all of these various events. We then ran that series of events that I mentioned where we began rolling out new pieces of legislation and our federal asks. In a traditional year federally, the Alzheimer's Association and AIM supports quite a wide variety of pieces of legislation, but early in the year and then build up to an advocacy forum, we try not to provide people with hundreds of different bills to talk about. We really want to focus our efforts. And so in a normal year for our advocacy forum, we have 3 asks or so, 3 pieces of legislation that we're really going to hammer on. And this year, because we had a series of events, we had sort of months of preparation, and folks were chiming in virtually, this actually allowed us to change the number of asks and the way we presented our legislative asks to our advocates. Instead of having to print stacks of paper and then frantically lose our minds as we realized that a bill number had changed or there was a new ask on the table and we would have to go back and reprint packets, because everything was in that virtual space, we could change out materials faster and on the fly. We could get the latest updates from the Hill. We could reprioritize based on what was progressing through Congress over those months in the lead up to our event. So we were able to be a little more dynamic than you are when you have a fixed event in a physical space at a singular time. So one of the things that we were really surprised by is that in a normal year, our advocacy forum is 1,000 to maybe up to maybe 1,500 person event. Simply put, there aren't hotels that big in DC where you can have a conference of that size. But this year, because we went to a virtual format, because we had these build-up events and we could increase buy-in and better train folks, and also increase accessibility. We had almost 2,400 folks participate in our advocacy forum. Now, this was a real game changer for a lot of folks who were previously unable to attend. Staff who don't necessarily work in our public policy department and maybe didn't traditionally have a work reason for them to fly to DC and incur those costs now could participate virtually. Advocates in this, with the same issues, folks who are caregivers and simply do not have the time to fly across the country and spend many days away from their loved ones. Individuals, with all sorts of other factors that prevented them from coming to our event, financial or otherwise, they could now participate from the comfort of their home and affect change in Washington, D.C. So we saw a huge uptick in first-time participants, with hundreds of first-time participants who were now open to this world. And we also were able to increase the number of bills that we could focus on. Instead of 3, we actually focused on 5 different congressional asks. This includes increasing research funding and passing specific pieces of legislation. That was really a fundamental shift for our advocacy forum. And our states saw similar results. Many of our states who traditionally would have to incur the costs or the logistical problems of putting people on buses or in cars and trucking them halfway across the state to go to the state capitol for only a few hours of engagement could now have engagement over a period of days. Some turn their advocacy day into a week of action where they would have different sets of actions over time, including virtual meetings, days of social media outreach, you name it, the sky was the limit. And so many of our states saw increased participation and higher levels of engagement. We were very, very happy with these outcomes. We are a large organization, but we also noticed that, for some of our smaller chapters, places around the country where we do not have a high number of staff, we could still achieve these results, with less of a lift than we might see for in-person events in the past. So with that, I'll turn things back over.
Fantastic. Chris, really, really impressive. I think a prime example of making the most of that shift online. Huge congratulations. We've heard today about rolling with the punches to build community, to maintain, even improve on the important grassroots work that you all are used to doing. Luke touched on this point, but I want to reiterate that Phone to Action now does a lot more than grassroots. Alerts and monitoring at every level of government, down to local, and of 80,000 news sources and all of Twitter, the world's biggest database of campaign contributions for help in fundraising. Every component of that joined by a system for logging meetings, taking notes, otherwise doing the real work of government affairs. We'll cover all of those in more detail in the future. You can expect more sessions like this one. I'd be remiss not to mention what we're capable of. If you've got any questions about how we might be helpful, about any of those tools, about grassroots, about all that we do, please give me a shout. My contact information is on the screen, accompanied by a picture of me as a younger man. And we'll transition now to questions for our panelists. I appreciate that they have been flowing in. Thank you so much. That button at the bottom still works. If you move your mouse around, for me, it's on the bottom right, Q&A. Please use that to submit your questions, and we will respond to all of them that we can. And to begin with, just reiterate for everyone's peace of mind, I hope, yes, the recording will go out to all registrants, and we will make sure you're taken care of. The one to start with, I think, addressed to everyone, experienced users that we've got here. We're a relatively new Phone to Action client, and we had a recent local campaign where we signed up 650 advocates, nice job, and drove 150 calls to lawmakers. Do the panelists have recommendations on how to build the profiles or how to tag advocates so that we can strategically segment and engage them in future calls to action? It sounds like those characteristics that you want to assign to your advocates to fine tune the asks that you're making of them.
So I can speak to the way that the Alzheimer's impact movement tends to address that issue. First is we tend to look at behaviors first. So anyone who demonstrates that they've tweeted at a member of Congress or made a phone call is likely to repeat that action in the future. What we want to shy away from are folks who will repeatedly send emails and we see that on their account and then we go out with a campaign asking them to tweet. You know, it does happen, but sometimes, but we generally tend to look at the style of behavior and what they've done and tag them accordingly. So whether that's a physical tag or using the segments feature that Phone to Action has, we will label folks according to that.
Terrific. Terrific. Chris, I think, you know, a couple questions that I combined here, folks would hope to hear from you. And Deanna, I expect you as well, given the virtual fly-in experience that you've now had. To begin with, can you share more about the precursor events to the virtual lobbying days that you pulled off? I know you mentioned, Chris, that you know, you got people prepared over time. How effective was that, and how did it strike your advocates getting ready?
So for most of our advocates, at least at the federal level for the Advocacy Forum, there was an expectation that we would prepare them. Simply put, no one wants to walk into a congressional office in a traditional year and you know, without any prep, without materials, you know, handouts or leave behinds, without some knowledge of what they're asking for. And in a virtual environment, it's the same thing. So taking that into account, we did an initial welcome to Congress type event where we sort of gave folks the lay of the land, new members, leadership, things like that, so they could just sort of sense where their members were in the grander scheme of things. We then also, of course, informed them about pending legislation or you know, or legislative activity that was coming down the pipeline. And then, of course, we would give them background on those bills. And sometimes that can be a simple, you know, here's a few talking points in some, you know, in some places. But for us, we like to train to beyond just a few talking points. It's things like how to deliver an effective message, how to work those into personal stories, things like that. And that takes a little longer than, you know, simply handing someone a list of talking points. So that's why we had multiple events in the build-up to make sure that folks were comfortable for the most part with those asks and the information we were sharing.
Yeah, and I can add on to that. I definitely agree with Chris that preparation is absolutely key. If you're meeting in person with a legislator or virtually, it goes the same. I would say the majority of our folks that participated in our most recent virtual fly-in had done at least one, if not more, virtual meetings in the last year. So folks usually were already familiar with the platform, knew kind of what they were getting into. But we did have folks from some key states where we don't actually have a ground game. You know, these are people that maybe we found through a recruitment email, but had never actually met with them before, and they've never lobbied their member of Congress before the actual meeting. So with those folks, we do a lot of preparation, you know, kind of one-on-one meetings. We do small group meetings. So if you're in the Arizona team or the Georgia team or New York, you know, we're meeting with those groups individually as many times as folks ask for, really. It's at least one, but I think the more prepared and confident people feel, the more effective results and better results we're going to get from those meetings. One thing I forgot to mention in the Action Center, we included, kind of similar to what Chris was saying, a few presentations that we had pre-recorded about kind of how to have an effective meeting. We also put in there a recording of a mock meeting. So we had some of our colleagues that pretended like they were senators or a staff member and just showed them, you know, what a 10-minute video or 10-minute meeting might actually look like. So providing materials and having them housed in one area was helpful for that preparation aspect.
That I would also add, and this is some of my background working on the Hill, that the more direct and succinct you can help your clients, prepare them with a direct, succinct message, you're just going to have much more success. And I would say that's even more true online and virtual. There's just less attention span for a long Zoom meeting than an in-person meeting. So the more obvious you can make whatever you're asking, the better, because you never want to leave a meeting where they're like, I'm not really sure what they wanted. So if it's more funding, you need to be direct and ask for it. I know it's always hard to ask for more federal dollars, but direct is key.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thanks to all of you. Some really good ideas there. Deanna, I like the piece about max preparation with materials in hand for folks. Luke, to keep it with you, we've got a couple people who'd like to hear a bit more about the different things that you're paying attention to with GovPredict. It sounds like you're casting a wide net. You mentioned different sources that you're gathering from. I think by now the idea of getting alerts about a bill that's important is something that people are familiar with and are knowledgeable about. Could you speak a little bit about how you handle these other alerts? How do you organize them? What do you do with them? Anything along those lines?
Yeah, so when you're talking about members of Congress, I would say the most productive dialogues that you're going to get are in committee hearings. And if you have a relatively small team as we do, it's hard to watch every minute of every hearing. You may miss members' questions or their reactions to certain things. The GovPredict tool pulls in transcripts from the hearings, and then you can set up key terms of if a member said, this, that, or the other, and then the next morning you get a full alert of every member who mentioned whatever issue you're tracking. So committee hearings, I would say, are probably the most helpful, but you can pull in dear colleague letters, letters that members are sending to the administration that are posted somewhere that they didn't necessarily do a press release about and put on their own website, because those are happening all the time. They're sending forms of communication that are trackable, and GovPredict picks them all up. And that's not just for Congress and the legislative branch, but they pull in all of the deliberations that the departments and the administrations have too. And if you have a good, narrow, refined search of all of the issues, it's a very useful email that you can get every morning. You could get it more than once a day if you'd like. We have it set up to receive at just before 9 a.m. And it's if a member tweeted something in your issue sect, if it's from a hearing from the other day or a press release, it's all right there.
Fantastic. Fantastic. On the topic of virtual fly-ins that people are evidently interested in, and rightfully so with the knowledge that we've got here, to combine a couple questions. Broadly, how do you all envision the transition back towards in-person visits to the Hill? And I think, along with that, technologically, what would you like to keep, to discard, to change about your process that you now know you're capable of as folks start to get back into it in person?
So for us, there are a few factors. So there is a difference between the states and obviously the federal government when it comes to their procedures. Congress has yet to really provide clarity as to what's going to happen with the Capitol building. Security measures that are currently in place and procedures. They may fundamentally change, or there may be a one day where we kind of say, yep, everything's back to normal. I think the former is more likely. It is entirely possible that the days of milling around in the cafeteria or hanging out in the halls are gone. And, you may only be able to enter certain buildings by appointment, and things like that. So some of that's a wait and see game. That will sort of determine if upcoming events are fully in person, or, as we suspect, there will be more of a hybrid model where there's still quite a bit of online and digital engagement, coupled with maybe a smaller physical presence in the district. Some organizations are hinting that they're going from these very large scale events to a series of smaller events, things like that. So the format can change, but a lot of that is still up in the air. What I will say is what we're hearing a lot from the Hill, and there's other vendors in the space and providers in the space, is that offices are willing to invest to expand their digital capabilities. Many staff actually came to prefer the online meetings and the virtual meetings because it gave them a different level of accessibility, just like our advocates had. One example that I'll give is there used to be a very distinct difference between an in-district meeting and a Capitol Hill meeting. You would go meet with the local district office, and there'd be a scheduler, and then someone maintaining basic programs in the area, and they would then take your information and eventually relay it up to the Hill, right, in a subsequent meeting. Now, the legislative assistant on Capitol Hill can jump into the same meeting you're having in a congressional district. And so the lines are blurred. And so your level of access changes, the conversations change, and the response change. So I think that will probably linger on for quite a while.
You pointed out, Deanna, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, the intel that you gathered from staffers, you said, was, I believe I'm quoting here, sharper, of a higher quality than you might have expected to get in person. I think for a lot of folks, hey, used to doing business in the traditional sense, that would, that would fly in the face of traditional wisdom. What was it that that made that possible, and perhaps allowed more openness and more sharing of the type that was beneficial to you?
Yeah, some of it, I would love to get in the mind of a congressional staffer and hear from them about their perspectives on this. We usually have more time with staff in a virtual setting. Like, I feel like in person, it's a lot easier for either a member themselves or their staff to get pulled in multiple directions. And, your 30-minute meeting gets shrunk to about 15 minutes pretty frequently. So I think, there's more time. I feel like there's more active listening happening on Zoom because there's not the distractions of the office and the TV on with CNN or whatever news program they're watching. So yeah, I think that's definitely what we've seen. We've gotten more co-sponsors directly from these meetings than we really ever have in in-person meetings. So I think that we will definitely continue with this format for the foreseeable future. I'm thinking maybe once, if the Capitol does open and kind of what that looks like, we could look at more targeted grass tops fly-ins that really are more of a cultivation tool than anything for us to cultivate our grass tops. But I think having meetings throughout the year where we're able to pull in, like Chris said, DC staff and district staff in the same meeting is a really great way to effectively get our constituents in front of their members.
Ted, I would also just add, some of the offices had internal policies about various platforms and others. I remember a time when we did an educational briefing and we had 20 staff sign up, and it was a Zoom link, and only one of them joined in person, the rest of them dialed in. And at the time they were like, we're not doing Zoom meetings. I'm not exactly sure why. But they were all dialed in and very engaged. So I would just say, keep an open mind, and phone calls they're very open to that and accessible that way as well.
Definitely. And Philip, thanks for your point in the chat. Certainly something to think about, as Deanna and Chris have mentioned. Couple questions about the nuts and bolts for you, Chris and Deanna, and your answers might differ. A two-part question. How did you go about scheduling meetings with offices? In this new environment, did you get a time frame from your advocates and work with the offices, or vice versa? And once you were there, did you think about an average group size that you wanted to have in the room, in the virtual room? Did you put a cap on it? Did you find an ideal balance for what might have been too few or too many people?
Yeah, I can jump in first. For scheduling, we did it exactly how we would do an in-person fly-ins. We worked directly with the congressional schedulers. For our recent fly-in, just kind of arbitrarily chose different days of the week for each state, just to help us as the people in the room, kind of helping, be a support system for our advocates. It helped us not be spread too thin. So having all the Arizona meetings in one day, Georgia the next day. We found that staff have really, I think offices are really flexible with what types of platforms they want to use to meet. Either they let us set up the Zoom links or set it up themselves. It kind of was just based on what the scheduler suggested. For how many participants, we've kind of found the sweet spot is no more than 5. Given a half an hour, that allows everybody a chance to talk, but doesn't get to the point where people don't have any time to actually participate in the meeting. So I think that's what we've gone with, but I don't know, Chris, you have 2,400, so you might have a much bigger number than that.
So I actually kind of agree with on that point, because the number, so there's the number of presenters or speakers, and then there's the number of other individuals in attendance, and that's something to take into account. Similar to the old town hall meetings or the virtual town halls, the 1,000 people call in, but how many of them actually get to ask a question? It's the same dynamic with a lot of these virtual meetings. That's one of the reasons why we actually went through the sort of the extensive preparation building up to the event, was to set expectations that not every person was going to have 10 minutes to share their personal story. Some folks might go on there, simply introduce themselves, say where they're from, and then that was the extent of their participation in that meeting. But in another meeting, they'd have a more leadership role and could do something elsewhere. So setting those expectations was a big thing. But we had meetings from 1 to I think over 50 in some of these virtual meetings, but we did not encounter the issues of 50 people trying to talk at the same time, because we either shifted platforms to some that allowed a little more granular control for one person in particular, or because we simply prepared them and those folks realized that this is the order of speaking, this is how we're going to present our information. Now is not the time to chime in, that kind of thing. But I do think that sweet spot of 5, maybe 7 or 10 would kind of be where a normal meeting would max out. But you can certainly go bigger. In person, just so you know, many members of Congress have breakfasts or other large scale events where they'll bring in 100 people, or you can send 50 people up to their office. But you don't do it by surprise. So you let them know that that's what's incoming. And the same thing in the virtual space. No one should log onto a Zoom meeting expecting to speak casually to 3 people and have 100 faces staring back at them.
Fantastic. Very quickly, a specific question that came in for Deanna. I apologize, but I think I can answer. When it came to the success of your campaign, I believe you mentioned you wound up with not quite 100 new advocates and 200 petitions signed and sent off. Is that right?
Yeah, for that one video. Yeah.
Fantastic. And to close here, a question to address to the whole panel, where I'll sum up, what I think what people are putting in different words. Some organizations are still quite traditional in their approaches, and perhaps the folks in charge are not completely convinced of the value of technology that the 3 of you have used, obviously, so effectively. A lot of the work revolves around understanding whom you're targeting, how to convince them, of course, and that takes getting out there and meeting people. Could you say a few words about how technology has helped you log policy wins? How would you make the case, member of a small team, a small organization, how would you make the case to someone who might be skeptical about what can be done with your tools?
Luke, you want to take a stab
Sure,
at that?
sure. I can go first. So thanks. So I think we all have membership or principals or boards, and they all want to see results. And let technology help you achieve those and organize those and put those in an easy trackable place so that you can make an easy presentation to the people that you need to. Just makes your life a lot easier.
I always like to say that to varying degrees, I think advocacy should be sort of, if not platform agnostic, at the very least, the technology should get out of the way, right? It should not create barriers. It should open doors. And for us, whatever works is going to end up being the technology of the day. So if we need to resort to sending carrier pigeons, we'll do it, but hopefully not. That gets a little messy. But the reality is that most of the tools that are available today have helped us grow our reach, have made the process of bringing someone into the fold and then empowering them to deliver messages back out to policymakers. Most of the technology has made that easier. And that's what we're always looking for in this avenue. We really don't ever want to lose an advocate because of frustrations over a form or a button or a tool or a gizmo. And so I think that's where we've seen a lot of success, is just ease of use.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Deanna. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Chris, sincerely. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending. Before you go, I want to remind you, you'll see a 3-question survey when we close the webinar. Please do answer those if you wouldn't mind, just those 3. We read every bit of feedback we receive, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you so very much.